For 10 years, my uncle made me enter his mansion through the delivery dock while the rest of the family walked the red carpet. He told me charity cases eat in the pantry, stay in the shadows, and never look the real heirs in the eye. But as I sat down at the head of the boardroom table today, holding the master deed to every single asset his family owned, I looked him dead in the eyes and said, "Uncle Richard, your 15-minute lunch break is over. Pack your desk. If you have ever been looked down on, treated like a second-class citizen by the very people who were supposed to protect you, hit that like button, subscribe, and buckle up, because the story I am about to share is proof that karma does not just come around. Sometimes it signs your paycheck." My name is Noah Vance. When I was 12 years old, a sudden highway crash took both of my parents in an instant. I went from having a warm, laughter-filled home to standing in the freezing marble foyer of Blackwood Manor, clutching a torn duffel bag and trying not to let my hands shake. Blackwood Manor belonged to the foundation of Vance Maritime Logistics, an industrial shipping titan built from the sweat and blood of my grandfather, Arthur Vance. But in the eyes of my extended family, I was not a grieving child in need of a home. I was a parasite, an uninvited mouth to feed, and an embarrassment to their pristine high society image. My uncle Richard Vance had seized control of the day-to-day operations after my grandfather suffered a massive stroke that left him nonverbal and paralyzed on his right side, confined to a wheelchair in the quiet west wing of the estate. Richard was a man who measured human worth strictly by bank accounts, foreign investments, and private club memberships. His wife, Victoria, was even colder. She was a socialite obsessed with lineage and appearances, treating anyone without inherited wealth like infectious bacteria. Then there was their golden boy son, Julian, who was 2 years older than me. Julian learned very early on that cruelty toward me was not only permitted by his parents, but actively rewarded with chuckles and praise. From the very first night I arrived at the estate, Victoria set the ground rules with clinical precision. She tapped her French manicured nails on the cold granite of the kitchen island, looked down her nose at my scuffed sneakers, and delivered her verdict. "Noah, darling," she said, her voice smooth like ice, "you are only under this roof because of your grandfather Arthur's misplaced sense of charity. Space in the main residence is reserved for family that contributes to our name. You will sleep in the attic room above the carriage house, and during family dinners or high society galas, you are not to mingle with our guests. You will enter through the tradesman's delivery door. Is that understood?" I was 12 years old, shivering in wet clothes, my throat feeling as though it were lined with broken glass. I did not have the strength to fight back. All I could do was nod and look at the floor. For the next 10 years, that attic and the back doors became my entire reality. When Richard hosted black tie fundraising galas on the manicured lawns, I was handed a black apron and ordered to carry heavy silver trays of champagne from the service kitchen to the catering staff. If I stepped even a foot onto the main lawn to catch some fresh air, Victoria would hiss in my ear, telling me to get back to the pantry, where people did not have to look at my face. When Julian smashed his sports car into the Stone Estate gate at 19, Richard pulled strings to bury the incident, but he blamed the structural damage on the estate maintenance budget. To punish me for simply existing, Richard made me spend 3 consecutive weekends scrubbing motor oil stains out of the cobblestone driveway on my hands and knees. Julian would stand on the second-floor balcony with his friends, sipping vintage wine and tossing ice cubes at my back, laughing until his face turned red. "Missed a spot by the drain, charity boy," he would shout down at me. "Make sure it shines, or you don't get dinner tonight." The physical exhaustion was hard, but the calculated psychological erasure was far worse. Richard never missed a chance to remind me that I was a nobody. Whenever he needed someone to balance endless spreadsheets, reconcile shipping ledgers, or clean up inventory mess, He dumped stacks of folders onto my rickety desk in the attic. "You should get on your knees, and thank God we haven't thrown you onto the street," Richard would say, tossing dusty files in front of me. "Reconcile these port logs by sunrise. Do not complain. A boy with no name and no inheritance needs to learn what real labor feels like." I never argued. I never shouted back. Instead, I took every single insult, every late night, and every bit of disrespect, and I swallowed it whole. Because every night, after finishing the exhausting chores they piled onto me, I walked quietly down the stone pathway to the isolated west wing of the manor. While the rest of the family treated Grandfather Arthur like a forgotten piece of old furniture, I spent hours sitting beside his wheelchair. The room always smelled of cedarwood, peppermint, and sterile antiseptic. Arthur sat by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out toward the dark, rolling waves of the Atlantic harbor. He could not speak, but his steel-gray eyes were as sharp and intelligent as they had ever been. He tracked every movement, every shift in tone, and every emotion in that house. I would sit on a low stool beside him, reading him shipping logs, historical biographies, and tech journals. I would tell him about my schoolwork, my passion for software programming, and the algorithmic trading systems I was building on an old, refurbished laptop during the dead hours of the night. Whenever Richard walked into the room to perform his superficial 5-minute daily check-in, his attitude was nauseatingly fake. "Looking strong today, father," Richard would say, never once actually looking Arthur in the eyes, his gaze wandering instead to the priceless bronze statues and oil paintings decorating the room. "Do not worry about the maritime contracts. Julian and I have everything firmly in hand. We are restructuring the overseas shell companies next month. You just sit here and rest." The moment Richard turned his back to leave, Arthur's left hand, the only hand he still had partial control over, would clench into a trembling fist of silent rage. One stormy night, when I was 21 years old, Arthur grabbed my wrist. His grip was unexpectedly strong, his knuckles white, his breathing deep and deliberate. With trembling fingers, he tapped out a steady, rhythmic pattern against the polished wood of his armchair. It was a rhythm I had noticed him tapping for months, whenever we were alone. 3 short taps, 3 long taps, 3 short taps. It was Morse code, SOS. He moved his eyes deliberately, pointing toward the heavy mahogany drafting desk across the room. He blinked twice. I stood up, walked over to the desk, and ran my fingers along the bottom panels until I felt a hidden spring catch. A secret compartment slid open smoothly. Inside, there were no gold bars or bundles of cash. There was an encrypted biometric hard drive and a thick, wax-sealed manila envelope from a private legal entity called Vanguard Sovereign Trust. Inside the envelope was a handwritten letter from Arthur, dated just 3 days before his sudden stroke 10 years earlier. Noah. The letter read, "A predator only shows his true teeth when he believes his prey is completely helpless. I have watched Richard and Victoria for years. They do not care about the legacy. They only care about bleeding it dry. If you are reading this, it means my silence has allowed them to reveal their absolute worst nature. Do not strike early. Learn the systems. Master the numbers. The empire is not the brick and mortar. It is the legal covenant that holds the debt. When the time comes, take back what they tried to steal from your parents." Inside that encrypted drive were the digital master keys, corporate debt structures, private banking portals, and the irrevocable legal framework of a sovereign family trust that Richard had no idea even existed. Arthur had never lost control. He had built a fortress around his entire life's work, using his perceived helplessness as a test to see which of his bloodline were vultures, and which one possessed the discipline to rule. For the next 4 years, while Richard and Julian thought I was merely doing their accounting grunt work, I was actually managing the trust's offshore algorithms under the confidential supervision of Arthur's private attorneys. I studied every corporate loophole, tracked every bad investment Julian made, and quietly monitored the financial bleeding of Vance Maritime. 2 months ago, grandfather Arthur passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 88. The grief hit me like a tidal wave. For over a decade, that quiet room and that silent old man had been my only true family, my only anchor in a world that treated me like garbage. While I stood by his bedside, weeping quietly as the nurses respectfully pulled the sheet over his face, Richard and Victoria were already out in the hallway, pacing back and forth with their cell phones glued to their ears. "List the coastal estate first thing on Monday," Victoria whispered excitedly into her phone to a luxury real estate broker. "We will completely gut the West Wing. It feels too depressing and dated." Richard was laughing on a call with his investment bankers. "The full asset transfer will happen at the probate reading next week. I want the board to approve my golden parachute and expansion shares immediately. The Vance Empire is officially mine." They did not shed a single tear. They did not even wait for the earth on his grave to settle. 4 days after the funeral, a formal notice arrived from Sterling and Finch, the most prestigious corporate litigation and trust management firm in the country. The reading of Arthur Vance's final testament, the distribution of sovereign assets, and the appointment of the permanent managing director were scheduled for Thursday morning at 10 o'clock sharp in the penthouse boardroom of Vance Tower. On Wednesday evening, Richard walked into the carriage house kitchen where I was quietly packing my few belongings into my old duffel bag. He was wearing the vintage gold cufflinks my grandfather had worn on his wedding day, cufflinks Richard had stolen from Arthur's nightstand the morning after he died. "Noah," Richard said, crossing his arms and looking at me with pure condescension, "you have been included in the meeting roll call purely as a legal formality. The attorneys require all blood descendants to be physically in the room for the opening statement. You will wear a decent suit. You will sit in the back row by the water dispenser. You will keep your mouth shut. Once Arthur's small discretionary clause gives you your little payout, which might be enough for a few months' rent in a cheap suburb, you have 24 hours to clear your junk off my property." I looked at him calmly, zipped my bag, and said softly, "Understood, Uncle Richard." "Good boy," Richard chuckled, reaching out and tapping my cheek twice in a mocking, paternal gesture. "Know your place in this world." Thursday morning arrived beneath a dark, rain-soaked sky. The penthouse boardroom of Vance Tower was packed with 25 powerful figures. Senior board directors, corporate accountants, regional shipping managers, and private family friends. Julian was sitting with his feet propped up on an adjacent designer chair, wearing a 3-piece suit and playing on his phone. Victoria was draped in a tailored white coat, sipping sparkling water and chatting animatedly about summer vacations in Monaco. Richard was seated proudly in the center leather chair, beaming like a king about to receive his crown. I walked into the boardroom at exactly 9:55, wearing a simple, tailored charcoal gray suit. Julian glanced up, saw me, and let out an arrogant laugh. "Hey, Noah, the pantry is out of mineral water. Run downstairs and carry a case up before the partners arrive, would you?" A few of the younger corporate yes-men around the table chuckled to earn favor with Julian. I did not break stride. I walked right past Julian and moved straight toward the head of the 20-foot mahogany conference table. "Noah," Victoria snapped, her voice cutting through the chatter like a knife. "What do you think you are doing? The visitor seats are behind the wooden partition. Do not embarrass this family in front of the legal team." Before she could stand up, the heavy double doors swung wide open. Marcus Sterling, the 70-year-old senior managing partner of the firm, entered the room with 3 junior attorneys carrying sealed leather folders and biometric security readers. "Good morning, everyone," Sterling said in a deep, commanding voice. placing his case down at the lectern. Please take your seats. We are gathered today pursuant to the irrevocable governance directives of the Arthur Vance Sovereign Trust. Richard smiled widely, leaning forward with his hands clasped on the table. Thank you, Marcus. We are ready to proceed with the executive succession. Let us make this as brief as possible. Julian and I have an international investors summit scheduled for noon. Sterling did not smile. He adjusted his glasses, opened the main black folder, and looked across the room. Before we review any personal bequests, Sterling announced, we must address the primary condition governing all corporate assets of Vance Maritime Logistics, established 15 years ago. Richard's smile faded slightly, his brow furrowed. Condition? What condition? I am the acting chief executive officer. The lineage protocol transfers corporate control directly to the lineal corporate successor. That is where you are completely mistaken, Mr. Vance, Sterling stated with total calm. 15 years ago, following an internal investigation into unauthorized capital diversions, Arthur Vance permanently stripped the corporate structure of lineal succession. He placed 100% of the voting equity, shipping vessels, real estate holdings, and treasury reserves into the Sovereign Overseer Trust. The boardroom went dead silent. You could hear the rain tapping softly against the thick glass windows outside. Victoria shifted in her seat, her voice rising in pitch. What are you talking about? Richard runs this company. We run this estate. Richard managed the daily operations under a temporary corporate charter, Sterling clarified, looking straight at Richard. A charter that expired the exact second Arthur Vance drew his last breath. Under the strict covenants of the Sovereign Trust, no relative, no board executive, and no beneficiary can touch, liquidate, or withdraw even a single cent from any account without the explicit, written approval of the appointed sovereign chairperson. Julian scoffed loudly, throwing his hands in the air. All right, whatever. Grandfather was paranoid. So who is the chairperson? My dad. Me. Let's just sign the papers and get on with our day. Sterling turned his gaze away from Julian and looked directly toward the head of the conference table, where I was standing. The chairperson was personally selected 10 years ago by Arthur Vance, subject to continuous character assessment, fiduciary discipline, and full administrative oversight. Sterling read aloud from the certified court document. As of midnight yesterday, the sole chairperson and ultimate beneficial owner of all controlling shares of Vance Logistics is Mr. Noah Vance. The words echoed off the glass walls like a thunderclap. The color vanished from Richard's face instantly. His mouth hung open. The arrogant smirk on Julian's face froze, then completely shattered into pure confusion and horror. Beside them, Victoria's hand shook so violently that her crystal glass slipped from her fingers, smashing against the hardwood floor and sending sparkling water across her designer shoes. What? Richard screamed, slamming both hands on the table and lunging upward. That is impossible. That is a forgery. Noah is a nobody. He is an orphan living off my charity. He cleaned my driveway. He washed my son's car. Mr. Vance, sit down immediately, Sterling warned, his voice cutting like a steel blade. Every single document here bears federal court seals, cryptographic authorization, and recorded video depositions from Arthur Vance. Noah Vance has spent the last 5 years quietly managing the trust's private accounts under our direct supervision. He owns the debt. He owns the land. He owns the building you are standing in right now. Julian stood up, his face turning bright crimson with rage. This is insane. You little thief. You manipulated a sick old man. Dad, call the security team. Have him thrown out into the street. I did not yell. I did not flinch. I slowly put both of my hands flat on the polished table, leaned forward slightly, and looked straight into Julian's panicked eyes. Julian, I said, my voice low, steady, and clear. Take your feet off the furniture. You do not own it. Julian tried to hold my gaze, but the utter coldness in my eyes broke him. He swallowed hard, his chest heaving, and slowly sank back into his chair, looking like a scared child. I turned my eyes to Richard. My uncle was gripping the edge of the table, so hard his knuckles were purple, beads of sweat breaking out across his forehead. For 10 long years, Uncle Richard, you told me I was nothing, I said, stepping slowly around the table until I stopped right in front of him. You made me eat in the pantry like a stray dog. You made me enter through the service door in the rain. You walked through grandfather's house, acting like a conqueror while he sat trapped in that wheelchair, thinking his silence was your victory. Noah, listen to me, Richard stammered, his voice trembling, all of his pompous authority evaporating into thin air. We took you in when nobody else wanted you. We gave you shelter. We are your blood family. Family. I cut him off smoothly. Family does not make an orphaned child scrub oil off the ground while laughing from a balcony. Family does not pick out curtains for an old man's bedroom before he is even buried. I looked across at Marcus Sterling. Mr. Sterling, please inform the board of the current debt status regarding Richard and Julian Vance's private ventures. Sterling opened the red financial audit folder. Over the past 36 months, Julian Vance incurred $34 million in private liabilities through high-risk offshore speculation. That debt was personally backed and guaranteed by Richard Vance's private real estate, luxury vehicles, and personal bank holdings. Victoria let out a breathless, horrifying scream, grabbing Richard's arm. Richard, tell me that isn't true. What did you do? It means, I said, looking down at my uncle with a faint, calm smile, that the Sovereign Trust bought that entire $34 million debt portfolio 3 days ago. Uncle Richard, you don't work for this company anymore. You owe me everything you have left. Richard collapsed heavily into his chair, burying his face in his trembling hands, looking utterly destroyed. Noah, please, let us settle this privately. Julian made bad choices, but we can fix this. Do not destroy our lives. I am not destroying you, Richard, I whispered, leaning down so only he could hear the final blow. I am simply making you enter through the back door. I stood up straight and looked out over the entire boardroom. Effective immediately, Richard Vance is terminated from all executive duties. Julian Vance is permanently removed from the corporate register. The private credit cards and luxury allowances for all secondary family members were frozen 15 minutes ago. Victoria was sobbing uncontrollably now, her head resting on the table. Where are we supposed to go? Where are we going to live? Blackwood Manor is registered under the trust. I replied coldly. You have exactly 48 hours to pack your personal clothes and vacate the property. The security team has strict orders to supervise every box you carry out. I paused, looking directly into Victoria's tear-stained face. And Victoria, when you carry your boxes down to the driveway, make sure you use the tradesman's delivery entrance. The front door is reserved for people who actually own the house. Not a single board director moved to help them. In corporate boardrooms, loyalty dies the very second power changes hands. One by one, the executives stood up, turned their backs on Richard and Julian, and bowed their heads respectfully toward me as they quietly exited the room. Julian tried to make one last desperate rush at me, screaming wild curses, but building security, men whose salaries were now secured by my signature, stepped in instantly, pinning his arms behind his back and marching him straight toward the service elevators down to the street. When the room finally emptied, I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling glass wall, looking out at the city below. The storm clouds were breaking apart, and a brilliant golden beam of sunlight hit the surface of the harbor water. I reached into my pocket and pulled out Grandfather Arthur's old silver pocket watch. I clicked it open, Inside was a tiny picture of my mother and father holding me as a baby, and right beside it, Arthur standing proud on the deck of his first cargo ship. The anger was gone. The heavy weight I had carried on my shoulders for 10 years had completely vanished. They had spent a decade trying to bury me in the dark, never realizing that some things only grow stronger when they are buried. Over the following year, Richard and Julian had to sell off their luxury cars, private watches, and private properties just to settle the debt judgments the trust enforced against them. Julian now works as an entry-level cargo loader at an independent logistics yard 300 miles away, earning an hourly wage. Richard lives in a small, rundown apartment, spending his twilight years managing tax debt. As for Vance Maritime Logistics, we raised the wages of every single driver, warehouse loader, and maintenance worker by 40%, because true power is never about making people feel small. True power is having the ability to destroy the people who hurt you, and choosing instead to build a life so untouchable that their shadows can never reach you again. Never mistake patience for weakness. When people treat you like nothing because they think you have no way to fight back, remember that karma takes its time to write the most perfect ending. Stay focused, do the work in silence, and let your results deliver the final verdict. If this story gave you chills and delivered the justice you were waiting for, smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below sharing your thoughts. Stay strong, keep your head high, and I will see you in the next story.